Brothers and sisters, have you ever wondered what will happen after this life? I ignored it for years, living as if everything depended on me, as if tomorrow were guaranteed. But one day, everything changed. I died, and what I saw on the other side was terrifying. A place full of darkness, screams, and torment. But in that abyss, in my greatest despair, Jesus showed me something that changed everything. This is not just my story. It could be yours too. Allow me to share with you what I discovered in hell and how His love was the only escape. Before continuing, check if you're subscribed to this channel to not miss this and other impactful stories that could change your perspective and bring you closer to the truth that transformed my life. That truth began to reveal itself the moment I understood how far I was from God. I lived as if He didn't exist. My life was a constant pursuit of pleasure, immediate satisfaction, and personal success, all without caring about the consequences. I woke up each day with the sole goal of filling my life with more things: money, recognition, adventures. If someone talked to me about Jesus, I simply laughed. To me, those stories were for weak people, those who needed comfort because they couldn't face life on their own. My days were filled with excesses. Nights were a mix of alcohol, parties, and empty company. I surrounded myself with people, but my heart was alone. I didn't care about hurting others, and that meant I got what I wanted. I lied without hesitation, manipulated situations to my advantage, and my ego was my god. I believed I had everything under control. I was the master of my destiny. But in reality, I was building my life on sand. I remember moments when something inside me, a small but persistent voice, told me I was wrong. But every time I felt that calling, I drowned it out with more noise, loud music, new purchases, new conquests. I always found something to distract me from that uncomfortable feeling. I didn't want to face the truth because the truth meant change, and I didn't want to change. My parents were believers, and many times they tried to talk to me about God. My mother prayed for me every day, but I ignored her tears. My father, with patience, spoke to me about Jesus' love, but I responded with sarcasm. I told them to stop dreaming, that I was fine, that I needed no one but myself. My pride was so great that I couldn't see the harm I was causing, not just to them but also to myself. Work, money, and material things were my refuge. I strove to earn more, to have the fanciest car, to wear the most exclusive clothes. I wanted everyone to see my success, to envy my life. But deep down, I knew something was missing. There was a void that none of that could fill. At night, when everything was silent and the lights of the parties dimmed, I felt a weight on my soul that I couldn't explain. But even then, I didn't want to admit I needed something more. I thought I could fix it on my own. My relationships were superficial, based on interest and convenience. Friendships, partnerships, all were temporary. I used people and then left them behind as if they didn't matter. I believed I was living life to the fullest, but in reality, I was more lost than ever. I denied anything that spoke of moral or spirituality, saying it was a waste of time, that life was short and should be enjoyed my way. If someone asked me about God, my answer was always the same: God has no place in my life. I mocked those who went to church, calling them hypocrites or fanatics. I thought I was above them, smarter, stronger. But the truth was that I was running from a truth I didn't want to face. And that truth was that although I had everything, I had nothing. Now, looking back, I realize how far I was from peace, from true love, from salvation. In my arrogance, I had built an invisible prison, one I couldn't see, but that was destroying me from within. I believed I was living life, but in reality, I was dying slowly, day by day, away from the grace and purpose for which I was created. And so that day arrived, one that seemed like any other. I woke up hurriedly with my mind on my plans. An important meeting in the morning, lunch with colleagues, and a party at night. My life revolved around myself, always seeking more. That morning, as usual, I didn't spend a second reflecting on anything other than my success and ambitions. I didn't even imagine that this day would mark the beginning of a change I could never forget. I clearly remember the sun shining as I got into my car, a luxurious vehicle that symbolized my pride. I felt invincible, as if nothing could touch me. I was driving fast, too fast because time was my enemy and every minute counted. As I sped down the highway with the music blasting, my mind was already on the next objective. I paid no attention to the small details, not to the traffic, not to the signs. I believed I had control of everything. Suddenly, the unexpected happened. A truck on the opposite lane lost control. I saw it coming as if in slow motion, but at the same time, it was so fast that I had no time to react. The impact hit me before I could understand what was occurring. The sound of metal crashing, glass shattering, the scream that came from my own throat, everything was chaos. In a matter of seconds, the whole world stopped. Then everything went black. It was as if someone had flipped a switch. There was no pain, no sound, nothing, just an overwhelming emptiness. I tried to open my eyes but couldn't. I wanted to move, but it was as if my body no longer existed. In that instant, I knew that something had changed, something irreversible. It wasn't just an accident. I had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. The emptiness was absolute, a silence so profound it seemed deafening. There was no light, no warmth, no life. I tried to understand where I was, but there was nothing to compare this experience to. It was an abyss, an endless space of darkness. I felt lost, completely alone. For the first time in my life, I had no control. Everything I had accumulated, my success, my money, my status, meant nothing in that place. I began to feel fear, a fear like never before. It wasn't just fear of the unknown. It was a deep dread, as if my soul knew it was in danger. It was the feeling that something was terribly wrong, and I could do nothing to stop it. At that moment, my mind started to replay my life as if I were watching a movie, but it wasn't a happy movie. It was a record of every wrong decision, every cruel word, every moment I had ignored what was right. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. I was trapped, not just physically, but spiritually. It was as if everything I had avoided facing during my life was now catching up with me. I noticed a pressure, a weight on my chest, but it wasn't physical. It was as if my soul was being crushed by the truth, a truth I had denied for so long. It was then that I understood, in a way words cannot explain, that my life had ended and what came after was out of my control. There was no more time for excuses or justifications. In that emptiness, I knew I was about to face something much larger than myself. And for the first time in my life, I realized how truly small and insignificant I was without God. When I opened my eyes, I found myself in a place that I cannot fully describe with human words. The first thing I felt was unbearable heat, a heat that didn't burn my skin but penetrated to the deepest part of my being, as if every fiber of my soul was being consumed. The darkness around me wasn't ordinary. It was a living, heavy blackness that seemed to absorb any hope, any comfort. In the distance, I heard music screams. They were heart-wrenching, desperate cries filled with a pain that couldn't be compared to anything I had known on earth. Each scream resonated like an endless echo, bouncing in the darkness as if this place was designed to amplify suffering. I wanted to cover my ears, but I couldn't. It was as if those laments were inside me, impossible to avoid. Looking around, I saw shadows moving. At first, I thought they were people, but they weren't human. They were grotesque, deformed figures with eyes full of hatred and mockery. These creatures looked at me as if they had been waiting for my arrival. They didn't say a word, but their presence filled me with paralyzing fear. They didn't need to speak. Their looks said it all. This is what you deserve. It seemed their silence shouted this. The ground beneath my feet was strange. It felt solid, but at the same time unstable, as if I was walking on something alive that was trying to trap me. There was fire everywhere, but it wasn't normal fire. Its flames were dark, as if the fire itself was suffering. The air was dense, hard to breathe, filled with a sharp smell like sulfur and something rotten. Each breath was a painful effort. Then something deeper hit me, the regret. It was a feeling so strong I could almost touch it. I remembered every moment of my life when I rejected God, Every time I ignored his call, every selfish choice, every hurtful word, every act of pride. It was all there, like an unbearable burden on my shoulders. I couldn't escape it. It was as if my own conscience had become my severest judge. In that place, I understood something I had never wanted to accept in life. Hell wasn't just a physical place, but an absolute separation from all that is good, from all that comes from God. There was no love, no peace, no hope, only desperation, a total sense of abandonment. And the worst part was knowing that I myself had chosen to be there. I couldn't blame anyone else. Every decision, every rejection had led me to this place. The shadows began to close in around me. I realized I couldn't move, as if the weight of the place had immobilized me. The creatures laughed, a sound that wasn't human, full of evil. I tried to scream for help, but no sound came out of my mouth. I was trapped, and the reality of my condemnation began to sink into my mind. This is forever, I thought. It was an unbearable thought, but I couldn't escape it. Then, something within me started to break. It wasn't just fear, it was a deep recognition of my need, my emptiness, my mistake. For the first time, I truly understood what it meant to be away from God. And that understanding was more painful than any fire, any scream. It was torment I couldn't endure, and I knew there was no escape. There, in that place, I met the true meaning of repentance. Suddenly, as if a curtain was lifted before me, I began to see images, scenes that were not unfamiliar. It was my life. Everything was there. Every moment, every decision, every word spoken or left unsaid. It was as if a movie was playing in my mind, but this time I couldn't ignore it or change the channel. And worst of all, I couldn't look away. I had to face every second, without excuses, without justifications. I saw the first time I lied to get out of trouble, a seemingly small lie, but one that deeply hurt someone who trusted me. I could see their face, their disappointment, something I had ignored at the time. I felt a weight on my chest, as if every lie turned into a stone I carried upon me. Then I saw how those lies grew over the years, how they became a habit that not only affected me, but destroyed others. The images continued. I saw how I hurt the people who loved me. I saw my parents silently crying over the decisions I made, praying for me while I scorned them. I remembered every time I ignored their advice, mocking their faith, and now those words echoed in my mind like an endless reverberation. Every tear they shed for me felt like a burn on my soul. Then came my relationships. I saw the hearts I broke, the promises I didn't keep, the people I used for my benefit. At the time, I never thought about the harm I was causing, but now I could feel his pain as if it were my own. It was as if every selfish action I had taken returned to me multiplied, hitting me relentlessly. I saw their faces, heard their voices, and every word they spoke was an accusation piercing my heart. The most terrifying thing was seeing my indifference towards others. I saw people in need of help, but I was too busy with my own world to stop. I remembered the homeless man I once ignored as he asked me for food. I could feel his hunger, his desperation, and I realized how cold and empty my heart had been. They needed consolation, but I set them aside because their problems were an inconvenience to me. Everything was there, clear as water, and I could not escape from it. Each sin, each wrong decision was not just a memory, it was a real weight. I could feel it crushing me. I couldn't blame anyone else. I had done this. I had built this prison with my own hands. At that moment, I understood something I had never wanted to accept. My sins had not only distanced me from God, but also from the person I was supposed to be. They had transformed me into someone I didn't recognize. All the pride, all the arrogance I had held during my life now crumbled before me, leaving a devastating truth in its place. I was responsible. I had chosen this path. The pain was indescribable, not just physical, but emotional and spiritual as well. It was a torment that went beyond any earthly suffering, and the worst part was knowing I couldn't go back. I couldn't change anything. Each decision had already been made, and now I had to face the consequences. It was a mirror in which I saw myself, not as I wanted to be, but as I really was, and that vision was the greatest torment of all. In the midst of this suffering, as my soul seemed to crumble under the weight of my own guilt, something new began to happen. In the suffocating darkness that seemed to close in tighter and tighter, shapes began to emerge that I could barely distinguish at first. I thought they were shadows, figures my mind was confusing in that chaos. But they weren't shadows, they were beings. And as they approached, I could feel their evil, a malice so deep it seemed to envelop everything around me like a heavy cloud. They were demons, but not as I had imagined them. They had no horns or cartoonish forms. They were deformed, grotesque, and their presences conveyed something much worse than fear. They conveyed a total absence of love. Their eyes, if I could even call them that, reflected nothing but hatred. But it wasn't ordinary hatred like one might feel on earth. It was absolute disdain, pure hatred that fed on my suffering. Their faces, if those features could be considered faces, were twisted in expressions of mockery. They laughed, but not with a laugh that came from their mouths. It was a laugh that resonated in my mind, mocking every scream I tried to emit, every desperate thought that crossed my head. One of them came closer than the others. His figure was larger, more imposing. He didn't speak, but his presence filled me with paralyzing terror. His shape was almost liquid, constantly changing as if he were solid smoke. I felt him lean towards me, and although he had no visible mouth, I heard a voice inside my head, deep and resonant. This is what you always wanted, freedom, independence, to live without God. Isn't this what you sought? His mockery was like a knife driving deeper and deeper as he spoke. The images of my life returned, but this time they were distorted. The moments when I chose to ignore God repeated, and those beings fed on them, as if each rejection of God's love gave them more strength. I could feel their satisfaction. For them, my pain wasn't enough. They wanted more. They moved around me, whispering things I didn't understand, but that echoed like a reverberation in my soul. I tried to scream, but my words wouldn't come out. It was as if they had stolen my voice. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't respond. They didn't need to physically chain me. The weight of my guilt and choices was enough to keep me trapped. Their laughter intensified each time I tried to resist. It was as if every attempt to fight made them stronger, as if they reveled in my helplessness. There was no compassion in them, none at all, no glimmer of humanity, no remorse, not even a hint of empathy. They weren't like human beings who do evil, but still have a vestige of goodness. They were the complete opposite of everything good. If love is the essence of God, they were the absolute absence of that essence. There was no light in them, no truth, no mercy, only chaos and destruction. At one point, I perceived that one of them was touching me, although it wasn't physical contact. It was as if he had entered directly into my being, ripping out every positive emotion, every happy memory, and leaving only emptiness. That contact was worse than any fire, worse than any physical punishment. It was the feeling of being completely alone, abandoned even by myself. They didn't need to torture me with weapons. My own soul was the battleground, and they were winning. As they continued, I realized something terrifying. They weren't doing this because they had to, they did it because they wanted to. There was a perverse delight in their actions, a dark pleasure in watching my suffering. Every time my desperation grew, they seemed to become more alive, more powerful. And I understood that this was hell, not just a place of pain, but a place where the absence of love and mercy was complete, and where demons took pleasure in the suffering of those who, like me, had rejected God. In the midst of all that darkness, surrounded by the fire that continued to burn my soul, and encircled by those demons that seemed to devour my hope, I felt I had reached my limit. I couldn't bear it anymore. The weight of my sins, the constant accusations, the torment of my conscience, and the absence of love were too much. There was no rest, not a single moment of relief. Everything was suffering, a suffering that seemed eternal. Then, something deep within me broke. I don't know how to describe it, but it was as if, in the midst of all that despair, something deep in my soul, something I had ignored all my life, began to scream. I suddenly remembered my mother's words, those prayers I had heard so many times, where she asked Jesus to take care of me, to not let me get lost. I remember my father speaking to me about a love I never understood. At that moment, those words returned with force, as if they were embedded in my mind. But there was something more. Deep within all my pain, I noticed a small glimmer, hope. It was tiny, like a spark in the midst of a storm, but it was there. And without much thought, I did the only thing I could do. Between cries and tears, I shouted with all my strength, "Jesus, help me." It wasn't a perfect cry. It wasn't a shout filled with faith, because even then my mind still doubted. But it was sincere. It was everything I had at that instant. Something changed. I don't know how to describe it, but it seemed as if the air around me had stopped. The demons that had been moving freely now halted and began to retreat, as if an invisible force was pushing them away. Their laughter faded, and their faces, which had been full of mockery and hate, now reflected something different: fear. It was the first time I saw fear in them, and that change filled me with a feeling I hadn't experienced in what seemed like an eternity: relief. Then, in the midst of that absolute darkness, I saw something. It wasn't fire like the ones that had previously surrounded me. It was light, a light that started as a small dot in the distance, but quickly grew. It wasn't ordinary light. It was warm, full of life, a light that embraced me even before it reached me. When that light enveloped me, I felt something I had completely forgotten: peace. It was as if all the weight I had been carrying vanished in an instant. That light was not just light, it was a presence. And although I couldn't see a face, I knew with my whole being who it was. It was Jesus. He didn't need to tell me his name. I knew at the moment I realized he was there. In his presence, everything changed. There was no judgment in his eyes, no condemnation, only love. A love so pure and overwhelming that it made me fall to my knees. I wanted to speak, but I couldn't. Words were not enough to express what I felt. He didn't speak to me with audible words, but somehow I understood what he was saying. I knew he had been there all the time, waiting for me, looking for me, even when I was rejecting him. I felt his sadness for all the times I ignored his call, but I also sensed his joy for having finally called out to him. He didn't reproach me, didn't make me feel unworthy, although I knew I was. Instead, he lifted me up, held me, and for the first time in my entire existence, I felt what it was to be truly loved. At that moment, I understood something I had never comprehended before. Jesus wasn't there because I deserved him. He was there because he loved me, because his mercy was greater than my mistakes, because his love was stronger than any darkness. That love began to fill every corner of my being, expelling all fear, all pain, all guilt. For the first time, I felt free, not just free from that place, but free from myself, from my past, from the chains I had forged with my decisions. He lifted me up, not just physically, but spiritually. In his presence, I understood something I had ignored all my life. It wasn't about what I could do, but about what he had already done for me. In that light, in his love, I found everything I had always been searching for without realizing it. While I was in the presence of Jesus, surrounded by that light bringing peace, love, and hope, he began to show me something I had never seen clearly before. It was as if my life unfolded before me like a book being opened page by page. But these weren't common memories. They were specific moments, moments when Jesus had been there, extending his hand, and I had ignored him. Each scene hit me like a wave of emotions: shame, repentance, and surprisingly, gratitude. The first image I saw was from my childhood. I was a little girl sitting on the bed while my mother prayed for me. I could hear her soft but faith-filled voice saying my name. While asking Jesus to watch over me, to protect me and never let me go, I remembered how I used to laugh at such prayers when I grew up, saying they were unnecessary, that I had no time for them. But now, seeing that moment with clarity, I understood something I hadn't noticed then. Jesus was there listening, and his presence had been with me even when I didn't know it. Then I saw a specific night from my youth. I had gone out with friends seeking thrills and fleeting pleasures. On the way home, I had a minor accident, something I dismissed at the time as luck, but now, reliving that moment, I saw it clearly. Jesus was there. I saw his hand protecting me, preventing the accident from being much worse. I felt a mix of shame and awe because instead of thanking him that night, I continued to ignore him, trying to fill my life with empty things. Another scene appeared, this time from my adulthood. I saw a coworker talking to me about his faith, inviting me to church, telling me how Jesus had changed his life. I remembered how I looked at him with disdain, mocking his enthusiasm, telling him that religion was for the weak. Now, seeing his face full of hope as he spoke to me, I realized it was Jesus himself who had used that person to reach me, and I had shut the door once again. The images kept coming. I saw an old friend from childhood who offered me a Bible as a gift. I remembered taking it out of courtesy, but never opening it. That Bible was tucked away in some corner of my house, covered in dust. Now I understood it wasn't just a book. It was Jesus trying to speak to me, to guide me, and I had ignored that opportunity as well. Then I saw a night when I felt utterly lost, a moment when the weight of my life seemed to crush me. I locked myself in my room, feeling empty, and for an instant, I thought about praying. But I quickly dismissed the idea, telling myself it wouldn't change anything. Now, looking at that moment, I saw that Jesus was there, waiting for me to call him. His face didn't show anger for my rejection, but sadness, a sadness that broke my heart. He had been so close, and I had chosen to turn my back on him every time. Each scene was like a mirror showing not just my life, but also the boundless love of Jesus. Every time I ignored him, he didn't leave. Every time I rejected him, his love remained steadfast. Now I understood something I had never wanted to. His mercy didn't depend on me, on my merits, or my willingness to accept it. His mercy had always been there, constant and faithful, waiting for me to accept it. Tears fell from my eyes as I watched these scenes, a pain mixed with gratitude. It hurt to have ignored so many opportunities, to have rejected his love so often. But at the same time, I couldn't help but feel overwhelmed by his faithfulness. He had never left me, even when I did everything to push away from him. At that moment, I understood the true meaning of mercy, an unearned gift, infinite grace, a love that doesn't give up. Jesus looked at me as these images faded and said something I would never forget. I have always been with you and always will be. There was no reproach in his voice, only love, a love so pure it made me promise in my heart that I would never ignore him again. In his mercy, I found not only forgiveness, but also a new opportunity to live, a new hope that filled every corner of my being. Suddenly, everything stopped. The light that enveloped me began to gently dissipate, as if the climax of everything I had experienced was coming to a close. I felt that something was changing, something profound. My body, which had seemed non-existent, began to respond. It was as if a force was pushing me upward, toward a place beyond that darkness I had left behind. There was no sound, no sudden movement. I simply opened my eyes, and there I was back in my own body. At first, I didn't understand what was happening. My heart was beating strongly, my chest rising and falling, and my hands trembling. The first thing I saw was the face of a paramedic leaning over me, calling me by my name. "You're alive," he shouted, but I couldn't say anything. It wasn't just the shock of being back in the physical world. It was something much greater, as if my soul had been completely restored. On the way to the hospital, I couldn't stop crying. But these tears were not of fear or sadness. They were tears of gratitude, a deep recognition that God had given me a second chance. I felt my heart beating with new strength, as if each pulse carried not only blood but also purpose. I knew, without a doubt, that I hadn't returned by chance. I was here because Jesus himself had brought me back. In the days that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about what I had experienced. Every detail remained etched in my mind. The darkness, the screams, the demons, and finally, the light and the presence of Jesus. I remembered his words, his love, his mercy, and most importantly, I remembered the mission I now understood clearly. to tell the world what I had experienced so that others could know the love and power of God. The transformation I felt was not subtle. It was as if every part of my being had been renewed. Before, my heart was full of pride, selfishness, and empty desires, but now all of that had been replaced by something much greater, a deep love for God and for people. Things that once seemed important, money, status, pleasures, now meant nothing. All that mattered was living for the glory of God. I realized that my life was not my own. It never had been. It was a gift I now must use for a higher purpose. I began to share my story first with my family. When I told them what I had experienced, they cried with me, especially my mother. God always listened to my prayers, she said as her tears fell upon my hands. That phrase made me understand how much love there was in those who prayed for me, even when I didn't deserve it. But I didn't stop there. I felt an urgent calling to share my story with everyone who wanted to hear. Each time I spoke, I saw how people connected with what I was telling them. Some cried, others looked at me in disbelief, but everyone felt the weight of the truth in my words. It wasn't just my story. It was the story of how Jesus can rescue even the most lost, someone like me. Today, I live each day with a clear purpose: to be a witness to the mercy and power of God. I am not perfect, and I still have much to learn, but I know I am not alone. Jesus is with me, guiding me, giving me strength. Every time I look at the sky, I remember that moment when His light reached me in the deepest darkness. That light continues to shine within me, and I will never allow it to dim. If there's one thing I've learned from all this, it's that no matter how far you've gone, how deep you've sunk into your own sins, Jesus is there waiting with open arms. His love knows no bounds, and His mercy is greater than any mistake. Today, I am living proof of that, and I will spend the rest of my life telling His story. The story of how His love returned to me not only life, but an eternal purpose. That's why I am here today. I'm not sharing my story because I'm special or because I deserve more than others. I'm here because I want you to know that what I experienced is not just my story. It could be yours too. I want you to understand that no matter where you are right now, no matter how far you believe you've strayed, Jesus is calling you, just as He called me. I lived my entire life thinking I didn't need God. I believed my decisions, my achievements, and my desires were enough. But what I didn't understand was that with every step away from Him, I was digging my own spiritual grave. And dear friend, that emptiness you feel, that sense that something is always missing, is because we were created for something greater, to be in the presence of God, to live under His love and purpose. I wanted to think about your life for a moment. Maybe, like me, you've ignored the signs, the moments when God has tried to reach you. Perhaps there are people in your life who have spoken to you about Jesus, and you, like me, have rejected them. But I want you to know this: Jesus never tires of calling you. He never turns His back on you, even when you do. His love is patient and is waiting for you to take the first step toward Him. Don't wait until it's too late. Don't wait until you're on the brink of the abyss to realize you need Jesus. Today, while you're here listening to these words, He is calling you, and I assure you, by everything I've experienced, there is no place safer, more full of love and peace than in His arms. Jesus did not come into the world to condemn you. He came to save you, to give you life and life in abundance. I know it's easy to think you have time, that you can figure it out later, that there are still many things you want to do before considering God. I thought that way too, but life doesn't guarantee us a tomorrow. What you have is this moment, here and now. And in this moment, Jesus is offering you His forgiveness, His grace, His unconditional love. All you have to do is accept His invitation. I urge you not to let this opportunity pass by. If you feel something in your heart as you listen to this, that's His voice. That's His way of saying, "Come to me." No matter how broken we feel, how imperfect, His love is enough to cover every mistake, to heal every wound, to fill every void. Today, I want to invite you to reflect on your life. Take a pause and ask yourself, am I ready to meet Jesus? If the answer is no, then this is the moment. You don't need perfect words or a special place. You just need to open your heart and say, Jesus, I'm here. I need you. Forgive me. Come into my life. I promise you that simple prayer can change everything. My story did not end in darkness because Jesus rescued me. And today I want you to know that He can do the same for you. He is the light in the darkness, the refuge in the midst of the storm, the peace in the midst of chaos. Don't let the noise of the world drown out His voice. Seek Him now, before it's too late. Jesus loves you. He is looking for you, and He is waiting for you. Today can be the day when everything changes. Let Him in, and you will see how His love transforms not only your life, but your eternity. If this message